It was a perfect spring morning in the quiet neighborhood of Pine Hills. The sun was bright but not too hot, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the air. For most residents, it was just another ordinary day, but for one man and his loyal companion, it would become a day that changed everything. Mike was a 36-year-old construction worker who lived alone in a modest house at the end of Oak Street. His days followed a simple routine: work hard, come home tired, and enjoy the company of his best friend, a golden retriever named Buddy. Mike had rescued Buddy from the local shelter 3 years ago, after the dog had been abandoned by his previous owners. Since then, the two had become inseparable. Every morning before heading to work, Mike would take Buddy for a walk through the neighborhood park. It was their special time together, a peaceful moment before the hustle of the day began. Buddy wasn't just a pet, he was family. After losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago, Mike had struggled with loneliness until Buddy came into his life. The gentle, playful dog had a way of making even the darkest days brighter. That Wednesday morning started like any other. Mike clipped on Buddy's leash, grabbed his coffee in a travel mug, and headed out the door. The park was quiet at this early hour, with only a few joggers and fellow dog walkers making their rounds. Buddy trotted happily beside Mike, occasionally stopping to sniff an interesting patch of grass or wag his tail at passing strangers. "Good morning," Mike nodded to Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who was out walking her small terrier. They exchanged pleasant small talk about the weather before continuing on their separate ways. This was one of the things Mike appreciated about their morning walks: the sense of community, the familiar faces, the simple connections that made life feel a little less lonely. As they rounded the corner near the park's small pond, Mike spotted something unusual: a group of motorcycles parked along the curb. It was strange to see them there so early, especially since motorized vehicles weren't typically allowed in this section of the park. But Mike didn't think much of it. Live and let live, that was his motto. He continued walking, now approaching the park's main path where the trail widened. Buddy was happily trotting ahead, his golden fur catching the sunlight. The peaceful morning air was suddenly broken by the sound of loud voices and laughter. A group of 5 men in leather jackets were gathered near the park benches, their motorcycles parked just beyond the "No Vehicles" sign. Mike didn't want trouble. He gently tugged on Buddy's leash, planning to take the side path and avoid the group entirely. But Buddy, friendly as always, wagged his tail and pulled slightly toward the men. "It's okay, boy. Let's go this way," Mike said quietly, trying to redirect his companion. But it was too late. One of the men had noticed them and was now watching as they tried to pass by. He was tall with a heavy build, a thick beard covering most of his face, and sunglasses despite the early hour. Something about his posture made Mike uncomfortable. "Nice dog," the man called out, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. Mike nodded politely but kept walking. He didn't want to engage. Years of working construction sites had taught him when to keep his head down. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the man said, his tone hardening as he stepped into Mike's path. "What's the matter? Too good to talk to us?" The other bikers watched with amused expressions. Mike could feel the situation shifting, the morning peace evaporating into tension. "No problem here," Mike said calmly. "Just taking my dog for a walk before work." The bearded man looked down at Buddy, who was wagging his tail, oblivious to the growing tension. "Friendly dog, huh? Doesn't even bark at strangers." "He's a good boy," Mike said, trying to step around the man. "Now if you'll excuse us." What happened next occurred so quickly that Mike barely had time to react. As he tried to walk past, the bearded man suddenly swung his booted foot toward Buddy, connecting with the dog's side. It wasn't a full-force kick, but it was enough to make Buddy yelp in pain and cower behind Mike's legs. A rush of anger surged through Mike's body. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, stepping between the man and his dog. The bearded man just laughed. Dog shouldn't be so trusting. World's a dangerous place. The other bikers were laughing now too, as if hurting an innocent animal was somehow amusing. Mike checked on Buddy, who seemed frightened but not seriously injured. The golden retriever's eyes were wide, his tail tucked between his legs, a stark contrast to his usual happy demeanor. Something shifted inside Mike at that moment. He had always been a peaceful man, someone who avoided conflict whenever possible. But seeing his faithful companion hurt for no reason other than a stranger's cruel amusement awakened something primal within him. "You need to leave. Now." Mike's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Or what?" The bearded man stepped closer, towering over Mike. "What are you gonna do about it, dog boy?" Mike could smell the cigarettes and stale beer on the man's breath. Behind him, the other bikers had stopped laughing and were now watching with interest, perhaps hoping for some morning entertainment. "I don't want trouble," Mike said, his hand tight on Buddy's leash. "But you don't kick a man's dog. You just don't." The bearded man smirked. "Seems I just did." He looked back at his friends, clearly enjoying the audience. "And what are you going to do about it?" What Mike didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this confrontation was being observed. From the jogging path across the pond, a woman had stopped, phone in hand, and was recording the entire incident. And further down the path, a police officer on his morning patrol had noticed the motorcycles parked illegally and was already making his way toward the group. But in that moment, it was just Mike and Buddy facing a group of strangers who thought cruelty was entertainment. The next few minutes would change everything, setting in motion a chain of events that would come to be known throughout the community, and eventually online, as a powerful reminder that in this world, karma has a way of striking back when you least expect it. The bearded biker took another step toward Mike, his boots scraping against the gravel path. The other bikers had formed a loose semicircle, effectively blocking the path back to the neighborhood. Mike could feel Buddy trembling against his leg, still shaken from the unexpected kick. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Mike repeated, his voice steadier than he felt. "But you had no right to hurt my dog." The bearded man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the morning air. "And what exactly are you gonna do about it? There's 5 of us and 1 of you." Mike glanced around, noticing how alone they were in this section of the park. The elderly woman with her terrier was long gone, and the early morning joggers seemed to have taken different paths. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground. "I'm just asking you to leave us alone," Mike said, slowly backing away while keeping Buddy behind him. "We'll go our way, you go yours." "Maybe I'm not done with you yet," the bearded man replied, cracking his knuckles. "Maybe your mutt needs to learn another lesson." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As the bearded man reached toward Buddy again, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Everyone turned to see a uniformed police officer approaching from the path alongside the pond. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" the officer asked, his hand resting casually on his belt as he surveyed the scene. The bearded man immediately straightened up, his demeanor shifting. "No problem, officer. Just having a friendly chat." The officer looked at Mike, noting his tense posture and the cowering dog. "Sir? Everything okay here?" Before Mike could answer, a woman's voice called out from across the path. "It's not okay. I saw everything." A jogger in her 30s was hurrying toward them, phone in hand. "That man kicked this poor dog for no reason," she said, pointing to the bearded biker. "I recorded the whole thing." The biker's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about, lady." "Actually, I do," she replied, turning her phone to show the officer. "I caught it all on video." The atmosphere changed instantly. The other bikers began to step away from their bearded friend, creating distance between themselves and the trouble that was clearly brewing. "Officer, this is ridiculous," the bearded man protested, his confidence visibly faltering. It was just a little nudge. The dog got in my way. The police officer watched the video, his expression hardening. That doesn't look like a nudge to me, sir. That looks like animal cruelty, which is a criminal offense in this state. He turned to Mike. Would you like to press charges? Mike looked at the bearded man, who was no longer smirking. Something about seeing the bully suddenly vulnerable felt like justice already beginning to unfold. Buddy had stopped trembling and was now standing taller beside him, as if sensing the shift in power. Yes, Mike said firmly. Yes, I would. The bearded man's face flushed with anger. You're making a big mistake, he growled. You don't know who you're messing with. As the officer took out his notepad and began taking information, the bearded man tried to back toward his motorcycle. I don't have time for this. I'm leaving. I'm afraid you'll have to stay right here, sir, the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. We have a few things to discuss at the station. What none of them realized was that the woman's video was already being uploaded to social media, where it would soon take on a life of its own. The first threads of karma were beginning to weave themselves around the bearded biker, and his day was about to get much, much worse. By noon that same day, the video had spread like wildfire across local community groups. The woman who recorded it, Jen, had captioned it simply, "Man kicks innocent dog at Pine Hills Park this morning. Justice served." The bearded biker, whose name was revealed to be Ray Thompson, sat uncomfortably in the police station as the officer processed his paperwork. What had started as a morning ride with his buddies had turned into a nightmare. The animal cruelty charge was already bad enough, but things were about to get much worse for Ray. Back at the park, Mike had taken Buddy to the local vet just to be safe. The vet found no serious injuries, but gave Buddy some anti-inflammatory medication for the bruising. As they sat in the waiting room, Mike's phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications. The video had somehow found its way to him through neighborhood friends, and he was stunned by how quickly it had spread. "Your dog okay?" the receptionist asked as Mike prepared to leave. "He'll be fine, just a little shaken up," Mike replied. "I saw that video," she said, shaking her head. "Horrible man. My sister works at Riverside Motors, you know. Says that guy's their head mechanic there." Mike nodded politely, not really processing the information as he focused on getting Buddy home to rest. But across town, that connection was proving crucial to Ray's unfolding karma. The owner of Riverside Motors, Tom Walsh, was having lunch when his phone exploded with messages. Regular customers, fellow business owners, and even his own employees were sending him the same video, of his head mechanic kicking a helpless dog and then being arrested. Tom's face grew hot with anger as he watched. His auto shop had built its reputation on community trust over 20 years. They sponsored local Little League teams and donated to the animal shelter's annual fundraiser. And now his head mechanic was the most hated man in town. Without hesitation, Tom made a call. Meanwhile, at the police station, Ray was finally being released with a court summons and a heavy fine. His motorcycle buddies had abandoned him hours ago, unwilling to wait or be associated with the trouble. As he walked out into the afternoon sun, his phone rang. "Thompson," he answered gruffly. "Ray, it's Tom Walsh." The voice was cold and businesslike. "Tom, look, I can explain. I've seen the video, Ray. Everyone has seen the video. Your things will be packed up by end of day. Don't bother coming back to the shop." The line went dead before Ray could respond. He stood frozen on the police station steps, the reality of what was happening beginning to sink in. In just a few hours, he had been arrested, fined, and now fired from his job of 8 years. As he finally made his way to his motorcycle, the only friend that hadn't abandoned him today, Ray found a parking ticket stuck to the handlebar. He had parked in a no-parking zone at the park, and now owed the city another $150. And unknown to Ray, his day was far from over. The wheels of karma were still turning, and the video was now reaching people from his past, present, and future, people who would ensure that his momentary cruelty would have lasting consequences. Back at home, Mike sat on his porch with Buddy resting peacefully beside him, neither of them aware that their morning incident was becoming the talk of the town, and that karma was just getting started. By evening, Ray Thompson's face was recognizable to nearly everyone in town. The video had been shared thousands of times, picked up by local news sites, and had even caught the attention of a popular animal rights page with millions of followers. Comments flooded in, with people expressing outrage and calling for justice. Ray sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, ignoring the constant buzz of his phone. He'd turned off all social media notifications after the 10th threatening message. How had a split-second bad decision spiraled so completely out of control? He opened his refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and slumped onto his couch. The reality of being jobless hit him hard. Riverside Motors had been more than just a paycheck, it was where all his professional contacts came from. In the automotive world, reputation was everything, and his was now in tatters. His phone rang again. This time, it was his landlord. "Hello?" Ray answered cautiously. "Thompson, it's Bill Harper. We need to talk about your lease." Ray's stomach dropped. "What about it?" "I've got 6 months left. I've received multiple complaints from other tenants about having you in the building. They've seen the video." "Come on, Bill. That's not fair. What I did has nothing to do with my apartment." "Maybe not, but I've got families with kids and pets in this building who don't feel comfortable anymore. I'm not renewing your lease when it's up, and I'd prefer if you found somewhere else before then." Before Ray could argue further, there was a knock at his door. "I gotta go," he muttered, hanging up. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Ray approached cautiously and looked through the peephole. Outside stood Jerry, the president of the motorcycle club Ray had been trying to join for months. His heart sank even further. "Open up, Thompson. I know you're in there," Jerry called. Ray reluctantly opened the door. Jerry's expression was grim, his arms crossed over his leather vest that bore the club's insignia, something Ray had coveted for years. "Jerry, look." "Save it," Jerry interrupted. "The guys and I saw the video. We don't want any part of it, or you." "It was just a stupid mistake," Ray protested. "Our club does charity rides for the animal shelter every year. We raise thousands for rescue dogs. You think we want to be associated with a guy who kicks a man's pet?" Jerry shook his head. "Your application is denied. Permanently. And don't show your face at any of our events again." With that, Jerry turned and walked away, leaving Ray standing in his doorway, watching another piece of his life crumble. Later that night, as Ray tried to sleep, his phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from his sister in the next town over. "Ray, I'm so disappointed. Mom would have been heartbroken to see what you did today. Katie saw the video at school and came home crying. That's her uncle in that video, hurting an animal for no reason. We won't be coming for Sunday dinner this weekend. I need time to figure out how to explain this to your niece." Ray stared at the ceiling, the weight of consequence pressing down on him. The job loss, the housing threat, the club rejection, those were all painful. But his sister's message cut deeper than anything. In less than 24 hours, one thoughtless, cruel moment had cost him nearly everything he valued. And somewhere across town, Buddy the golden retriever was curled up peacefully beside Mike's bed, blissfully unaware that his ordeal had sparked a chain reaction that was still unfolding. The next morning, Ray woke up to the harsh reality that yesterday hadn't been a nightmare, it was his new life. His phone showed dozens of missed calls, including one from his court-appointed attorney reminding him of his upcoming hearing for animal cruelty charges. Ray made coffee and stared out his kitchen window. Across the street, a neighbor walking her dog saw him and quickly crossed to the other side, giving him a cold glare. Word had spread through the apartment complex, and he was now the man everyone avoided. For the first time since the incident, Ray had a moment of genuine reflection. He'd never considered himself a bad person. Sure, he had a temper and sometimes acted without thinking, but he'd never imagined becoming a social outcast overnight. The image of the golden retriever's frightened eyes flashed through his mind, followed by the hurt and anger on its owner's face. "What was I thinking?" he muttered to himself, rubbing his tired eyes. The truth was, he hadn't been thinking at all. His phone rang, displaying unknown caller. Hesitantly, he answered. "Hello, is this Ray Thompson?" a woman's professional voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Linda from Ace Auto Repair. We were considering your application for our mechanic position, but I'm calling to let you know we've decided to go with another candidate." Ray frowned. "I applied there months ago. You're just now deciding?" There was a pause. "To be honest, Mr. Thompson, we've seen the video circulating online. Our shop values don't align with that kind of behavior. Good luck in your search." The line went dead. Ray placed his phone down slowly. He hadn't even remembered applying to Ace Auto. Now job prospects he didn't even know he had were vanishing. Across town, Mike was experiencing the opposite effect of the viral video. As he walked into the construction site where he worked, his coworkers greeted him with pats on the back and words of support. "Hey, saw what happened to Buddy. That guy got what he deserved, huh?" his foreman said during their morning meeting. Mike was surprised. "You saw the video?" "Everyone's seen it, man. My wife showed me last night. It's all over Facebook and Twitter. They're calling you Dog Dad Defender in the comments." During lunch break, Mike checked his phone and was stunned to find dozens of friend requests and messages from strangers. The video had indeed gone viral, with over 200,000 views and climbing. Local news outlets had picked up the story, and there was even a fundraiser started for the local animal shelter in Buddy's name that had already raised thousands. "This is crazy," Mike whispered to himself, scrolling through the comments. People were praising him for standing up to the biker, sharing stories of their own beloved pets, and expressing outrage at Ray's actions. One comment caught his eye: "The man who kicked the dog has been identified as Ray Thompson, head mechanic at Riverside Motors. Let's make sure everyone knows what kind of person they're hiring." Mike felt a twinge of unease. While he was glad Ray was facing consequences, the sheer scale of the backlash was overwhelming. What had started as a personal confrontation in the park had grown into something much bigger than he ever could have imagined. That evening, as Mike took Buddy for a short, gentle walk, their first since the incident, several neighbors came out to greet them, offering treats for Buddy and kind words for Mike. Buddy, ever the friendly spirit, seemed to have bounced back from his ordeal, wagging his tail and accepting pets from everyone. Neither Mike nor Buddy knew that across town, Ray Thompson was packing his belongings, preparing to leave the city where his name and face had become synonymous with cruelty. 3 days after the incident, Ray sat in his half-empty apartment surrounded by packed boxes. His sister wasn't taking his calls, his savings were dwindling, and the online harassment hadn't stopped. Earlier that morning, he'd found a crude note taped to his motorcycle: "Dog kickers not welcome here." Ray had decided to move to his cousin's place in a town 2 hours away. It wasn't ideal, his cousin barely had room for him, but it was his only option. As he taped up another box, his phone rang. It was his attorney. "Mr. Thompson, we need to discuss your upcoming court date," the attorney said. "The prosecution has the video evidence, which is pretty damning. They're pushing for the maximum fine and community service." Ray sighed. "What are my options? Honestly? A guilty plea might be your best bet. I could try to negotiate for reduced community service if you'd be willing to do those hours at the animal shelter." Ray was silent for a moment. The thought of facing people at an animal shelter after what he'd done made his stomach turn. But then again, maybe it was fitting. At the animal shelter, he finally asked. Yes. It would show remorse and a willingness to make amends. The judge might look favorably on that. After hanging up, Ray stared at the empty walls of his apartment. Work at an animal shelter. The irony wasn't lost on him. A week ago, he would have laughed at the suggestion. Now, it seemed like the only path forward. Meanwhile, Mike was experiencing a very different kind of pressure. Local news vans had parked outside his house that morning, hoping for an interview with the dog dad defender. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from reporters, and his construction site foreman had mentioned that a pet food company wanted to sponsor Buddy. This is too much, Mike told his neighbor as they stood in his driveway, watching another news car slowly drive by. I didn't do anything special. I just stood up for my dog. That's exactly why people love the story, his neighbor replied. It's about an ordinary guy doing what's right. Later that afternoon, Mike took Buddy to the park, a different one this time, hoping to avoid recognition. But within minutes, a group of dog walkers approached them. Is that the famous Buddy? One woman asked, her small terrier yapping excitedly. We saw you both on the news. Mike nodded politely as they crowded around, everyone wanting to pet Buddy, who soaked up the attention with tail-wagging enthusiasm. Have you heard they're organizing a community dog walk this weekend in support of animal protection? Another walker asked. They want you and Buddy to lead it. Mike hadn't heard, but he found himself agreeing to participate. Despite the unwanted attention, he believed in the cause. If Buddy's story could help prevent animal cruelty, maybe all this fuss was worth it. That evening, as Mike scrolled through his social media, he came across a post from the local animal shelter announcing a fundraiser in Buddy's name had reached $15,000, enough to upgrade their medical facilities for rescued animals. For the first time since the incident, Mike felt a sense of purpose emerging from the chaos. What had started as a terrible morning in the park was transforming into something positive for the community. What he didn't know was that the shelter would soon have a new, reluctant volunteer, and that his path would cross again with Ray Thompson's in the most unexpected way. 2 weeks later, Ray stood outside the Pine Hills Animal Shelter, dressed in plain clothes rather than his usual leather jacket. The judge had accepted his guilty plea, sentencing him to a hefty fine and 200 hours of community service at the shelter. His attorney had called it a fair outcome, but Ray still felt a knot in his stomach as he approached the entrance. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression greeted him at the front desk. Her name tag read, Carol, Shelter Director. You must be Ray Thompson, she said, her tone professional but cool. We've been expecting you. Ray nodded, avoiding eye contact. Yes, ma'am. I should make something clear right away, Carol said, leaning forward slightly. Everyone here knows who you are and why you're here. We've all seen the video. Ray's face flushed with shame. But, she continued, we believe in second chances for people, just like we do for animals. You'll be cleaning kennels, doing laundry, and helping with basic maintenance. You won't handle any animals directly until we feel you're ready. I understand, Ray said quietly. Carol led him to a small supply closet and handed him a blue volunteer shirt. Put this on. Then meet Luis in the back kennel area. He'll show you the ropes. Ray spent his first day scrubbing kennels, mopping floors, and washing endless loads of pet bedding. The work was physical and exhausting, but also oddly satisfying. By the end of the day, his hands were raw from cleaning solutions, but a small part of him felt like he'd done something worthwhile for the first time in weeks. As he was preparing to leave, he heard excited voices coming from the shelter's front reception area. Curious, he peeked around the corner to see a crowd gathered around a man and a golden retriever. Ray's heart stopped. It was them, the man and dog from the park. The ones whose lives he had changed, and who had unknowingly changed his. "We're so grateful for your support, Mike," Carol was saying. "The Buddies fundraiser has been our most successful ever." Mike smiled modestly, one hand resting on Buddy's head. "It's amazing what the community has done. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Ray watched as Buddy wagged his tail, seemingly enjoying the attention. The dog looked happy and completely recovered from their encounter. Something tight in Ray's chest loosened slightly at the sight. He was about to turn away when Buddy's head suddenly swiveled in his direction. The dog's ears perked up, and before anyone could react, Buddy pulled away from Mike and trotted directly toward Ray. Everyone in the room froze. Mike looked up, following Buddy's path, and his eyes locked with Ray's. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by surprise and then something unreadable. Ray stood rooted to the spot as Buddy approached him, sniffing curiously. He expected the dog to growl or back away, but instead, Buddy simply sat down in front of him, looking up with those same trusting eyes that had haunted Ray's dreams for weeks. The room was silent. Ray could feel every person watching, waiting for his reaction. Slowly, hesitantly, he crouched down to the dog's level, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly that only Buddy could hear him. The golden retriever tilted his head, then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He extended his paw toward Ray, as if offering a handshake. It was a simple trick that many dogs knew, but in that moment, it felt like something much more profound, a gesture of forgiveness that Ray knew he didn't deserve. And as he gently took the offered paw, Ray felt tears welling in his eyes for the first time since he was a child. The shelter went quiet as everyone watched the unexpected interaction between Buddy and Ray. Mike stood frozen, conflicting emotions washing over him. The man who had hurt his dog was now kneeling before Buddy, holding his paw with tears in his eyes. It was the last thing Mike had expected to see today. Carol quietly cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "Why don't we give them some space?" she suggested, guiding the other visitors toward the cat room. "We just got some new kittens in yesterday." Soon, only Mike, Buddy, and Ray remained in the reception area. Ray slowly released Buddy's paw and stood up, wiping his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. He looked different from the aggressive biker in the park, smaller somehow, the arrogance gone from his posture. "I didn't know you volunteered here," Ray said quietly, his voice rough. "I don't," Mike replied, still processing the situation. "We're here for a meeting about the fundraiser." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "He looks good," Ray finally said, nodding toward Buddy, who was now sitting calmly between the two men. "I'm glad he's okay." Mike studied the man standing before him. The viral video had painted Ray as a one-dimensional villain, but the person standing here in a worn shelter volunteer shirt looked more like a man who had lost everything. "Are you working here now?" Mike asked. Ray shook his head. "Community service. 200 hours. He paused. "It's part of my sentence." Mike nodded slowly. Another silence fell, neither man quite sure what to say next. "I want you to know," Ray finally continued, "what I did that day." His voice cracked slightly. "It wasn't about your dog. I was angry about other things, and I took it out on the first target I could find. It was wrong. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry." Mike had imagined this moment many times over the past weeks, confronting the man who had hurt Buddy, but he'd never expected an apology, or to feel the confusion he was experiencing now. "My wife died 5 years ago," Mike found himself saying, unsure why he was sharing this with Ray. "Buddy helped me get through it. He's not just a pet." Ray nodded. "I understand. I mean, I don't understand what you went through, but I get what he means to you." He looked down at his hands. "My life has fallen apart since that day at the park. Lost my job, my apartment, my friends. But I deserved it. What I did was cruel. Buddy, perhaps sensing the emotional tension, moved to sit beside Ray and leaned gently against his leg, a gesture of comfort he often offered Mike during difficult moments. The simple action broke something open in Mike's chest. If Buddy could offer forgiveness so freely, who was he to hold on to anger? You know, Mike said slowly, they need regular volunteers here. After your community service is done. Ray looked up, surprise evident on his face. You think they'd let me stay on? Animals are good judges of character, Mike replied, nodding toward Buddy. And they believe in second chances. Carol returned to the reception area, eyebrows raised in question as she took in the scene, no longer two adversaries, but two men standing in quiet conversation with a golden retriever contentedly between them. Everything okay here? She asked carefully. Mike looked at Ray, then back to Carol. Yeah, he said. I think it is. What had begun as a story of cruelty and karma was transforming into something neither man had expected, a chance for redemption, and perhaps even healing. 3 months later, the Pine Hills Animal Shelter was bustling with activity. The annual Paws in the Park event was in full swing, with dozens of families exploring booths, meeting adoptable pets, and enjoying the beautiful autumn weather. At the center of it all was a large banner reading "Buddy's Buddies," hanging over the main pavilion. Mike stood near the shelter's information booth, Buddy by his side wearing a bright orange bandana that identified him as the event's canine ambassador. Children stopped to pet him, and he soaked up the attention with his usual good nature. Hard to believe it all started with that morning at the park, Carol said, joining Mike with a clipboard in hand. We've had record adoptions this quarter, and the new medical wing will be finished next month. Mike nodded, watching as a young couple walked away with their newly adopted terrier. Sometimes good things come from unlikely places. Across the park, Ray was manning the volunteer sign-up booth. His 200 hours of community service had been completed weeks ago, but he had stayed on, gradually earning the trust of both the staff and the animals. Today he wore the same blue volunteer shirt, but with a sense of pride rather than obligation. What made you want to adopt? Ray asked a young woman who was filling out an application form. She smiled. I saw that video a few months back, you know, the one with the golden retriever. It reminded me how much joy dogs brought me growing up. Ray's expression remained neutral as he took her completed form. Well, I'm sure you'll find the perfect match here. As the event began winding down, Ray found himself face to face with Mike and Buddy. They had developed a cautious rapport over the past months, connected by their shared work at the shelter. Carol says you're becoming their best volunteer recruiter, Mike said, gesturing toward the stack of completed applications at Ray's booth. Ray shrugged. People want to help. I just point them in the right direction. He crouched down to Buddy's level, a habit he'd developed. How's the celebrity doing today? Buddy responded with an enthusiastic tail wag. We're actually moving off the front pages finally, Mike said. Yesterday someone asked me if I was that construction guy instead of the dog dad from the video. Progress. Both men laughed softly, the tension that had once existed between them now almost entirely dissolved. I got a job offer, Ray said suddenly. Mechanic position at Wilson's garage across town. That's great, Mike replied genuinely. Are you going to take it? Ray nodded. Part-time. Told them I needed my volunteer days here. He paused. The owner said he believes in second chances. Seems to be going around these days. As the sun began to set, volunteers took down banners and packed up tables. Carol announced that the day's event had raised over $25,000 for the shelter, a new record. Mike and Ray found themselves helping load the last of the equipment into the shelter's van, working side by side in comfortable silence. Buddy sat watching them, his golden coat glowing in the evening light. You know, Mike said as they finished, my neighbor's having a barbecue next weekend. Nothing fancy, just a few people from the neighborhood. You should come by if you want. The invitation hung in the air between them, not just an offer of food, but of something more meaningful: forgiveness, acceptance, perhaps even friendship. Ray looked at Mike, then at Buddy, remembering how a single moment of cruelty had destroyed his old life. But here, somehow, a new one had begun. "I'd like that," he said simply. And as they walked together toward the parking lot, Buddy trotting happily between them, the story that had begun with an act of thoughtless cruelty came full circle, a reminder that while karma may strike swiftly, its greatest power lies not in punishment, but in the chance for redemption it sometimes offers along the way.